My name is Matthew Platt. I'm an associate professor of political science at Morehouse College. I've been there for 6 years. This is year 6, I guess, year 7, something like that. What I teach about American politics in general, and I teach our undergraduate methods class. My research is on Black agenda setting in Congress. So where the question is, why does Congress pay attention to Black issues? And my basic answer is that they don't. And so trying to then figure out that even in that low level of attention, though, that there are still fluctuations. And so when are those periods when you are able to get some attention? And how that fits into our current kind of political situation, especially as regards to protest, is I published a small kind of descriptive paper in January in the, what is it called now? The National Review of Black Politics, I think is the new title for that journal, where it looks at the amount of attention that Black members of Congress pay to police brutality bills. Where the basic idea is that although kind of incidents like George Floyd, or we think back to Michael Brown when Black Lives Matter got started a few years ago, that while those might be kind of galvanizing moments that perhaps inform the broader public about problems, that if you are a Black member of Congress, you represent constituents who don't need to be informed about those problems, that they are completely, fully aware of those problems. So although the nation isn't paying attention, that you as a representative of Black constituents should always know that this is a pressing issue. And so the idea was that we should see some level of attention that fluctuates less around these national news stories. But instead, we find the opposite, that even among Black members of Congress, they only pay attention when the rest of the nation pays attention. So the high profile events so I look at it from 1972 until 2016, and it's the same high profile events that everyone talks about. Those are the only times when Congress, when Black members of Congress even pay any attention to police brutality as an issue. I think probably the demographics of the protests themselves, I think this is not something I've studied in any systematic way, but just existing occasionally on the internet. It seems that the demographics of the protests are different, and that it's not all Black, basically. That it seems much more multiracial than it seemed that Black Lives Matter was in 2015 or 2014. However, I think its effect is the same in that, just as with those old protests that I was speaking about in my own research, you see that Congress responded in exactly the same way to these protests, where now then they immediately began to take action. The Democratic House brought up a bill that they spent a lot of time on, made it a leadership priority, that even Republicans in the Senate made it a leadership priority to do something. And even though they couldn't come to a compromise and get anything done, it's still a level of attention that they would not have paid otherwise in the absence of those protests. So the effectiveness of the protests has not changed. And my broader work that looks beyond police brutality, when I look at kind of protests as a tactic, where there I'm looking from basically 1947 to about 2000 or so. It's the same pattern that we're seeing now, where the difference is that the protests are pretty much always effective. It's just that Black political leadership moved away from using protests. So this effective tool is used more rarely. And so my argument is that that's obviously not a very good strategy. If you have something that's effective, you should use it, as opposed to putting a lot of the energy of Black political energy into having kind of Black faces in high places, and then expecting those members to just magically do whatever we want them to do. That's proven not to be an effective use of resources. In part, I think it's ideological, and I don't mean that in even a negative way. That part of the goals of the civil rights movement was to attain political power in an established way. And so when you achieve that goal, you now want to switch to realizing the fruits of your labor. And so that seems perfectly understandable and it makes sense. The flaw is in thinking that that switch is the end of the story. So if I were to kind of criticize kind of the civil rights leaders of the past, we're speaking here of right from 1965 to 1980 or something like this, that the flaw was that they didn't realize how limited the victory was. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that you hear now and what we're seeing now is that more people are waking up or realizing or perhaps admitting to themselves that while there has been substantial progress, that there are deeply rooted kind of hard, stubborn problems that the kinds of progress that we've experienced don't really solve. And the kinds of problems that I would say that we would classify as those are the things that require loss and sacrifice on behalf of some. So providing public accommodations, right, like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that's aside from right, the most kind of hardcore segregationists, no one else is really giving anything up for that. But the kind of economic distribution, the kind of what some white parents might view as a sacrifice to send their children to a quote unquote bad school, right? That's things that people would experience as a loss. But those are the kinds of things that would address some of these more deeply rooted issues. And so they don't happen. And that's why the kind of inequality persists. So I think it's, we'll have to see, I think. I am unconvinced that the change in attitudes that are evident in like public opinion polls, I'm unconvinced that that's tied to changes in behavior. So when I think about, and so I no longer live in this kind of place. I live in a Black neighborhood in Atlanta and send my children to a Black public school. But my sense from my friends kind of outside in professional networks is that lots of people, young people will move into the city and they'll enjoy all the diversity that city life offers. But then they have children and their children reach a certain age and they have to think, am I going to pay some large amount of money on top of the large amount of money I'm paying on my mortgage and rent to send my child to a good school? Or am I going to move somewhere else so that we can have that school? And many people decide, I'm not going to sacrifice my child's future by sending him to that Black school. And I'm unconvinced that that kind of thing will have changed. And you know, and that's just one example, but I think it touches on the core issue. I think it matters certainly that people say, I am aware of certain levels of inequality. I think it's wrong. I think as a matter of public policy, we should do something about it. But that's not the same thing as here's the choice that I'm going to make in my own life that could potentially have negative consequences for my own children. I'm laughing because my answer to everything now is my ideal next step is that there is a national program of testing and contact tracing and supported isolation so that we are no longer in a pandemic and we can move back to regular life. I think that should be the next step for everything. I don't really care about anything until that's dealt with. But if I can imagine a non-hellscape world, then probably I think probably the biggest bang for the buck probably could be dealing with inequities at a younger age. So I'm a person who fully supports affirmative action in all aspects of life. I think people should fight for it hard and support it, and those who benefit from it shouldn't be ashamed of that or anything like that. But I think I do agree that it would be more effective if we dealt with the inequalities at the pre-K level, so that they don't continue into elementary and then secondary and all of the right. So if you could do that, and if there are interventions aimed at that, that I think would probably have the biggest bang for the buck in transforming outcomes for people in terms of their own lived experience. So it wouldn't really be all that sexy, or wouldn't kind of be the kind of the new cool thing, but I think actual people's actual lives would improve a great deal. And so I think about things like when he was running for president, Michael Bennett, I think, had a program that was aimed at basically eliminating child poverty by providing these kind of grants to families for their children at these young ages. And given that he was, I think, superintendent of Denver schools, he was also focused on these kind of interventions in education. So I think that would probably be where I would go. Now, again, caveat: is this the biggest deal in the world? Right? Well, no, because there's COVID and there's climate change and all these things. But in terms of, if I'm just focusing on how can I deal with inequality as quickly and effectively as possible, I think those are probably the levers to push. It's hard. It's hard to answer anything in a hopeful way right now. Uh, but I like to believe I was despairing even before it was cool. So I don't have much hope. Simply because I think it is hard to ask humans to give up stuff. And I think the kinds of changes that we need require people to give up stuff. Which isn't to say that we live in a zero-sum world and it always has to be give or take, because I don't necessarily believe that. But I think to have the world that we really want, that some people are going to have to be fine. Some people can even include myself, right? They're going to have to be fine having a little less than they have now. That we could probably do with better distribution of all kinds of resources that would make life overall better for all of us. But it's really hard to give any of that up. And so I'm not really hopeful that it would happen. And even in a more abstract sense, what I teach my students is that it is hard, I think, impossible to disentangle race from American politics at the institutional level, at the individual behavior level, that it's so intertwined that for me, it's very difficult to even imagine American politics where race is not the driving factor of everything. And so that is part of what drives my despair. And in some sense, it's just a lack of imagination on my own part, because I understand the world in the way that I see it. It's really hard for me to take a step back and envision a completely different society. So that's one thing I think that is an opportunity that's highlighted by the protests about the demographic shift, because it is driven by young people who, like in the civil rights movement, could see a world beyond segregation that their own parents couldn't really imagine. I think that's what we're perhaps hopefully seeing now, that we're seeing a generation of new activists and new people involved in politics who do have more imagination than I have. And that if they have that imagination, then it's at least possible that we could reach some of those goals.